Welcome to Governance Minutes, brought to you by the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals, and Knowledge Partner host, Corporate Board Member, along with contributor Thomson Reuters.
Welcome to this edition of Governance Minutes. My name is Ken Bertsch. We have with us today Jim Kroll from Towers Watson. He's senior consultant there. And we're going to talk about compensation discussion and analysis, the CD&A. Thanks, Jim, for being here.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks for having me. This is an outgrowth of a recent conversation we were having where I think we could have spent hours talking about CD&A.
Yeah, so I had suggested doing a 60-minute webinar with Jim maybe in December, and he said, oh, that's way too late. People have to hear about it now. They have to be getting going on their CD&A. There are a lot of issues. It's become much more complicated and time sensitive. So I said, okay, we've got this interview opportunity. We actually have 13 minutes, so this will be hopefully concise and to the point. And so we need to see what at the top of the list do people need to do on their CD&As.
That's a perfect segue, actually, concise and to the point, because that's what we're looking for in many CD&As, if not all of them, ideally, I guess. And I think that's one of the key points is companies are shifting now, and they're re-examining their formats and their content, and they're moving to get a bit more on point with the key messages they want to give. But that takes time to make that change. We've had a certain format in place for a few years now that companies have become accustomed to. So there's a lot of work to do in sensitizing organizations to these changes, meaning if the authors are, let's say, HR and legal, the C-suite obviously cares about the content and the board cares. So we have to make sure that our authors are preparing people for the change.
Okay. So then the coordination between all these people is complicated.
It's time consuming. It's like its own project plan, much as you prepare for your shareholder meeting. There's like a separate stream for proxy preparation and CD&A preparation.
Right. Okay. Well, so the one of the things I mentioned is that the institutional investors may be relying on the proxy advisory services and may not look at the proxy statement at all. If they do look at the proxy statement, for most companies it's going to be probably pretty quick. If there's spending a lot of time in your proxy statement, it probably means you've already triggered a red flag that came out to them. So what do you see companies doing well in this environment and improving?
You can use the CD&A to your advantage in this case with a few, I shouldn't call them tweaks. They feel like tweaks if you read a lot of CD&As like you and I probably do. But the executive summary is a great way. And it really helps present the company side of the story. So you mentioned sort of the concerns about proxy advisor influence. Well, what better way than to use an executive summary to make the key points about your compensation programs, your performance, your best practices, the outreach you've done to shareholders. There are a lot of great topics that you can highlight in a brief executive summary.
Okay.
You mentioned too that some shareholders are going to maybe only have a limited amount of time. Others might spend a lot of time. So it's really important that you're thematic, meaning if something is in your executive summary, you want to make sure you carry those themes throughout. Okay. And I think what we're seeing in some of the really good CD&As or in some of the challenging situations is a focus on rationale. So we're moving beyond just, we've done this to why have we done it, what's been the board's thinking, why is this good for shareholders. Okay. So that's another important thing we would want to see woven into CD&As as we head into the 2013 proxy season. Okay,
so it used to be just the facts, ma'am, kind of thing, and now it's why.
Yeah, the way I kind of think about it is, as you and I probably know, there's been a lot of discussion about comply or explain in other markets. And I feel like on the CD&As, for years now, we've kind of nailed the comply part of it. Okay. We know what we have to say in there, but now let's get really even more enhanced on the explain part of it and talk about the decisions and the rationale for those decisions.
Okay. So I wanted to also poke a little bit at what you see companies maybe not doing so well yet. So for example, in the executive summary, we were just speaking before the interview, and I made the point, I see some things labeled executive summaries that are not actually a summary. And you made the point that some are actually very long. So.
Right. I mean, there are some, I remember reading that when we start to approach 8 pages or more in the executive summary, I turn back and I look at the headers to make sure did I miss the transition. So when I think of an executive summary, I think briefer. And depending on whether or not you're using charts and graphs in your executive summary, that could impact the length, but you're probably still going to look to have maybe 2 to 4 pages before you transition to the real meat of the CD&A. So there is the length part of it, and the labeling part that you mentioned is important too, because I feel like it's very easy to pick up what you've done in the past and put a new label on it without thinking about what are you doing. So when I think about that, I think about maybe it's a good idea to sketch out separately what you'd want to say in an executive summary, rather than looking to a prior proxy if you're a company using an existing format that's not quite as visual as some of the newer formats we've seen. And that could help to have those points sketched out. The nice thing is I think a lot of companies have them and they don't realize they have them. What I encourage a lot of people to think about are, if you've done presentations to shareholders, some of your content may be there already. So look to that, because if they've been effective in your discussions, you certainly want to weave them into your CD&A. Things like executive summaries from committee meetings might help sort of seed some of the content that you'd use as well.
This may come a little bit out of left field, but as a layperson thinking about the timing on this, if my company has an issue with executive compensation and I'm trying to talk to investors and do various things, the coordination problem we just spoke about seems even more difficult. Because the HR people are on a certain comp cycle, so when policy is at question as well as the content of the CD&A, which comes first, the cart before the horse kind of thing?
Well, I think if companies are suspecting they could have a rough time with their next vote, or if they've had a rough time in 2012, they've probably already spoken to shareholders or on the verge of doing it, I would hope. Because we know the best time to reach out is when everyone's not busy, and in a few months we'll be at that point where everyone's too busy to speak. So you hopefully have some feedback there, which is helpful, and maybe it's even being used, ideally, in the planning process for compensation that's taking place and sort of bogging down some of our core audience from where we sit, the HR professionals. I think coordination among different groups internally and even weaving in some external advisors is helpful. We know HR and legal are sort of commonly running the show when it comes to the content of the CD&A, but sometimes it's helpful to bring in other perspectives too. You might want to bring in investor relations or corporate communications, and they can have some really helpful perspectives.
If you do have problems and you're looking to outside people, possibly like yourself, how do companies use your resource better? How do they use it worse? What do you see going wrong with it?
I think I'm biased, so I think the better way is earlier, much like I feel about CD&A drafting in general. I think if everyone's on the same page from the get-go when you're kicking off the process, especially if you're going to change dramatically the look and feel of your CD&A, it's better to have them alongside. I know there are often concerns about too many cooks in the kitchen sometimes, but you can use different people at certain points when they're best suited to make their contribution. It doesn't have to be everyone together in unison, or you can sort of carve up the tasks. And ultimately you do want someone overseeing everything so the CD&A feels like it's written with a common voice. So it's important not to lose that if you're going to give out certain tasks in the process. But I am a fan of earlier is better. I've seen very often where advisors are given drafts at a point when it's going to go to a committee in the spring, and it really is very difficult, if not impossible, to make meaningful changes. There's time at that point for changes that if it's determined that that's going to impact a vote potentially, people will get that done. But some of the other sort of nice to have things can sometimes fall by the wayside if they're not brought up until the end of the process.
I don't know if you would care to comment at all about graphical pieces that you like or don't like, or on that side of the equation at all. Do you get into that?
I do. I mean, they're nice. It's great to have them, and they can really help tell a story. They can be really important. I think the challenge is finding the right ones. I've read some CD&As where I've seen charts and graphs that really can stand alone and tell a story. And some companies have done a great job of using that to whittle back some of the text so that the text highlights what you really should notice from those charts. So there's an effective way. And then there's sort of a way that sometimes says, well, we feel like we have to have them because people are having them, but they may not be the right ones. So I think that's where it's really important to get an independent read of your CD&A whether it's internal or external, just to make sure that the graphics and the text are all flowing. And they're working together to tell the right story without being too heavy, for example.
Okay.
So.
Now this goes off from the CD&A a little bit, but the last 2 years we've seen a lot of supplemental filings, a fair number of supplemental filings, especially for bigger companies. Have those been effective? Do you like what you see? Are they useful?
There are all kinds of supplemental filings, and I think we heard from some parties that in the ones we saw this year, because there was a pretty meaningful growth, I think we're tracking well over 100 related to say on pay this year. That, you know, if you said it in a supplemental, why weren't you saying it in your CD&A in the first place? So I would say that's another resource for people who are drafting CD&As. One of the sort of tools you've got is if you had to do a supplemental last year, look at what you said. And particularly if it led to a discussion that was very effective and a shareholder said to you, oh, I get it now. That's something you want to have notes on that you weave into your future CD&A. I feel like CD&As that really spent a lot of time combating the proxy advisors may not have been that effective.
The supplementals that did
the
that,
supplementals,
yeah, right.
sorry, yeah. I think that's a point to keep in mind. Like, it's okay to disagree. I mean, that's not a problem. But you want to make your case so that the shareholder can support you. And I think one of the interesting outgrowths I heard about this year from the supplemental filings from investors was we needed something for the file so that we could switch our vote. So that's when they can really be effective. So let's say you've got an issue that as much as you planned for in the next CD&A and for the proxy season, something unexpected comes up. Well, a supplemental can really help clarify that issue and not only help a discussion with a shareholder, but then give that shareholder what they need to go back to a proxy committee or a portfolio manager to get them to support the company.
So it's really not just critiquing the proxy service, it's making a positive case
Right.
without getting lost in the length of the CD&A, but putting it out there.
Again, it should be a crisp document. Again, we've seen supplementals that were as long as some of the executive summaries that we just said, you know, at 8 pages we start to wonder. I think the challenge with the supplementals that you have to keep in mind lengthwise is this is the height of proxy season. So if we're talking about the companies with December year ends, shareholders are getting calls from any range of their portfolio companies being asked to have conversations. So it's really important that you give them something crisp in the supplemental as well. So there's a theme of crispness. I guess it's a fall theme, right?
Right, that's right, that's right. Well, I think that's all very helpful, and thanks very much. We'll be back about October 29th on the next Governance Minutes. Thank you.
Join us again next time for Governance Minutes, brought to you by the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals, and Knowledge Partner host, Corporate Board Member, along with contributor Thomson Reuters.